The morning sun painted golden streaks across Chicago O'Hare International Airport as Flight AA 2418 prepared for its journey to San Francisco. Rita Patel adjusted her navy blue uniform and pinned her silver wings, catching her reflection in the crew room mirror. After 15 years in the sky, she could tell this Friday morning felt different. There was an unusual stillness in the air, the kind that sometimes came before unexpected events. The pre-flight briefing went smoothly, with Captain Mike Thompson going through the usual checklist. Weather reports showed clear skies all the way to California, with just a bit of turbulence expected over the Rockies. Rita listened while arranging her long dark hair into a neat bun, her mind already running through the service sequence for the 4-hour flight. The boarding process started right on schedule at 8:45 a.m. Rita stood at the aircraft door, greeting passengers with a warm smile as they stepped onto the Boeing 787. The familiar smell of fresh coffee wafted from the galley where her colleague Jenny was preparing for the morning service. Business class filled up quickly with the usual mix of tech executives and consultants, their laptops and tablets already out before settling into their seats. "Good morning. Welcome aboard," Rita greeted each passenger, her eyes trained to observe little details. A nervous first-time flyer clutching their boarding pass too tightly, an elderly couple who might need extra assistance, a young mom traveling alone with 2 small children who could use some extra attention during the flight. The economy cabin was nearly full, with 264 passengers finding their places in the comfortable blue seats. Rita helped a grandfather store his heavy carry-on in the overhead bin while simultaneously directing a group of college students to their seats in row 28. Years of experience had taught her how to make every passenger feel personally attended to, even in the rush of boarding. "Excuse me," a well-dressed woman caught Rita's attention, her voice carrying a hint of authority. "Is it possible to get a window seat? I specifically requested one during booking." Rita checked her seat assignment, 34D, an aisle seat. Something about the woman's demeanor made Rita take special notice, though she couldn't quite explain why. The passenger's perfectly pressed business suit and pearl necklace suggested she was used to getting her way. But there was something else. A slight tremor in her hands, perhaps, or the way her eyes darted around the cabin. "I apologize, ma'am, but we're operating at full capacity today. I'll make a note and check if there are any last-minute changes before takeoff." Rita responded professionally, making a mental note to keep an eye on 34D during the flight. 15 years of flying had given her a sixth sense about passengers, and something about this one just felt off. As the final passengers settled in, Rita walked through the cabin doing her pre-flight checks. The young mom she'd noticed earlier was now entertaining her children with a tablet. The nervous first-time flyer was intently reading the safety card, and the woman in 34D sat stiffly in her seat, staring straight ahead. The familiar chime signaled the cabin doors were closed. Rita took her position for the safety demonstration, her movements precise and practiced. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, promising a beautiful day for flying. The powerful engines hummed to life, and the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. Little did anyone know that this routine morning flight was about to become anything but ordinary. As the wheels lifted off the Chicago tarmac at exactly 9:30 a.m., no one, not Rita, not Captain Thompson, and certainly not the 264 passengers, could have predicted the shocking series of events that would unfold at 37,000 feet above the ground. Events that would later make headlines across the country and change aviation protocols forever. 3 hours into the flight, the cabin had settled into that peaceful lull that usually comes after the meal service. Rita had just finished collecting the last of the coffee cups when the first call button chimed. It was from seat 34D, the woman who had earlier requested a window seat. "The air feels strange in here," she said, her fingers drumming anxiously on the armrest. "Can you check the cabin pressure?" Rita assured her everything was normal, but something about the woman's expression made her pause. The passenger, who had introduced herself as Diana Maxwell during boarding, was no longer the composed businesswoman from earlier. Her perfectly styled hair now looked slightly disheveled, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on her forehead despite the cool cabin temperature. 20 minutes later, the call button chimed again. Same seat. This time, Mrs. Maxwell complained about a strange vibration under her seat. Rita checked. Nothing seemed out of ordinary. The Boeing 787 was cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet, the gentle hum of the engines as steady as always. The third time the button lit up, Jenny was closer and responded. She returned to the galley looking puzzled. "She's asking to speak with the captain," Jenny whispered to Rita. "Says it's urgent." Something about the engine sound being off-pattern. The two flight attendants exchanged concerned glances. In their combined 30 years of flying, they'd encountered all types of anxious passengers, but this felt different. The fourth call came barely 10 minutes later. Rita watched as Mrs. Maxwell's finger jabbed the button repeatedly, her movements becoming more agitated. The passengers around her were starting to notice, throwing uncomfortable glances in her direction. A young businessman in 34E had quietly asked to be moved to a different seat, if possible. The temperature. Mrs. Maxwell insisted when Rita arrived, her voice tight with tension. "It's fluctuating abnormally. Don't you feel it? This isn't right." Her knuckles were white where they gripped the armrest, and Rita noticed she hadn't touched her half-finished ginger ale from an hour ago. Between calls, Rita observed Mrs. Maxwell from the galley. The woman would sit perfectly still for several minutes, then suddenly start scanning the cabin ceiling intensely, as if searching for something. She pulled out a notebook and began scribbling calculations, her pen moving frantically across the paper. Other passengers were becoming uneasy. A couple in row 33 asked if everything was all right. An off-duty pilot, sitting in row 35, made eye contact with Rita, subtly nodding to indicate he was available if needed. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from peaceful to quietly tense, like the air before a storm. By the sixth call in 2 hours, Mrs. Maxwell's behavior had become more erratic. She'd check her watch every few minutes, then look out into the aisle, then back at her watch. She'd requested 3 more ginger ales, but hadn't drunk any of them. Her expensive suit jacket was now draped over the back of her seat, her silk blouse showing dark patches of sweat despite the cool cabin air. Rita had been trained to handle all sorts of situations: medical emergencies, turbulence, unruly passengers. But something about Mrs. Maxwell's increasing agitation set off warning bells. It wasn't the typical anxiety of a nervous flyer, nor was it the belligerence of an intoxicated passenger. There was a frightening lucidity in her eyes, a focused intensity that seemed to be building toward something. The 7th call button chime came just as Rita was updating the lead flight attendant about the situation. This time, Mrs. Maxwell's voice had dropped to a whisper, her words careful and measured. "I need to speak with the captain immediately. Lives depend on it." Her hand trembled as she grabbed Rita's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. What she said next would set in motion a chain of events that would make aviation history. But at that moment, all Rita could focus on was the absolute conviction in Mrs. Maxwell's eyes as she leaned in close, her next words barely audible over the engine noise. The next few moments unfolded like scenes from a movie, but for Rita, it was all too real. Mrs. Maxwell suddenly pushed past her into the aisle, her movements jerky and unpredictable. The notebook she'd been writing in fell to the floor, pages of complex mathematical equations and diagrams scattering across the cabin floor. "Everyone needs to listen." Mrs. Maxwell's voice carried through the cabin, causing several passengers to look up from their books and screens. She stood in the middle of the aisle, her previously elegant appearance now disheveled, her eyes wild with urgency. "This aircraft isn't safe. We need to land immediately." Rita exchanged quick glances with Jenny, their years of training kicking in. Jenny discreetly moved toward the front of the aircraft while Rita maintained her position, keeping her voice calm and steady. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We can discuss any concerns you have there." But Mrs. Maxwell wasn't listening anymore. She paced the aisle, her expensive heels clicking against the floor as she moved back and forth. "The vibrations," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "The frequency is all wrong. Can't you feel it?" Her hands traced patterns in the air as if trying to catch invisible waves. Passengers began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A young mother pulled her child closer, while an elderly man removed his headphones to better understand what was happening. The off-duty pilot in row 35 stood up slowly, ready to assist if needed. Rita approached Mrs. Maxwell carefully, maintaining a non-threatening posture while trying to guide her away from the center of attention. "Let's talk about what's bothering you," she said softly. "We can go to the back galley where it's quieter." That's when Mrs. Maxwell grabbed Rita's arm. Her grip was trembling, but surprisingly strong, her manicured nails digging slightly into Rita's skin. She pulled Rita close, so close that Rita could smell the mint on her breath and see the beads of sweat on her forehead. "They've compromised the landing gear," Mrs. Maxwell whispered, her voice carrying a chilling certainty. "We're all going to die unless we land right now. The vibration pattern matches the frequency of metal fatigue. I've seen this before. They didn't listen then, and people died. They won't ignore it this time." The blood drained from Rita's face, not because she believed the woman's words, but because of the absolute conviction behind them. This wasn't the ranting of someone seeking attention. There was a frightening logic in her eyes, a clarity that made Rita's trained instincts tingle with uncertainty. Around them, the cabin had grown eerily quiet. The usual white noise of the engines seemed to fade into the background as passengers held their breath, watching the scene unfold. A businessman in the front row was filming discreetly with his phone, while a group of college students whispered among themselves, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Jenny had returned with the lead flight attendant, both positioning themselves strategically in the aisle. Through their subtle hand signals, Rita knew they were ready to implement their passenger restraint protocols if necessary. But something made Rita hesitate. Perhaps it was the way Mrs. Maxwell's hands shook as she pulled out more crumpled papers from her pocket, covered in what looked like engineering calculations. Or maybe it was the tears now forming in her eyes, not tears of hysteria, but of frustration and fear. "Look at the numbers," Mrs. Maxwell pleaded, shoving the papers toward Rita. "The harmonic resonance pattern is identical to Flight 2103. They covered it up then, but I won't let it happen again. I can't have more deaths on my conscience." At that moment, two men stood up from different parts of the cabin, their movements synchronized and purposeful. They hadn't shown any special badges during boarding, but Rita immediately recognized their bearing, air marshals. As they approached, Mrs. Maxwell's grip on Rita's arm tightened even more. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Check the landing gear. Just check it. I'll go quietly, but please, please check it. I can't watch another plane fall from the sky." The two air marshals moved with quiet efficiency, their training evident in every step. The taller one gently, but firmly separated Mrs. Maxwell from Rita, while his partner created a buffer zone between them and the other passengers. The cabin remained unusually quiet, everyone sensing the gravity of the situation. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," the first marshal said, his voice low and professional. He looked like any other business traveler in his khaki slacks and blue button-down shirt, which was exactly the point. Mrs. Maxwell didn't resist, but her eyes never left Rita's face. They moved her to the rear galley, away from prying eyes and recording phones. Rita watched as Jenny efficiently drew the curtain, shielding the scene from the main cabin. The lead flight attendant was already on the phone with the cockpit, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "I'm Agent Chen," the taller marshal said once they were in the relative privacy of the galley. His partner, who introduced himself as Agent Rodriguez, stood guard at the curtain. We'd like to understand exactly what you're claiming about the landing gear. Mrs. Maxwell's demeanor had changed. The wild energy from moments ago was replaced by an almost clinical precision. She asked for her briefcase, which Agent Rodriguez carefully retrieved from her seat. From it, she pulled out a folder filled with technical documents. 3 months ago, Flight 2103 reported unusual vibrations during descent, she began, her hands steady now as she laid out papers on the galley counter. The maintenance logs were altered to show routine wear and tear, but the frequency pattern was identical to what we're experiencing now. Rita watched as Mrs. Maxwell pointed to complex diagrams and charts. Despite the technical jargon, there was something compelling about her presentation. Agent Chen seemed to think so too, as he studied the documents with increasing attention. "You'll need to verify my credentials," Mrs. Maxwell continued, her voice gaining strength. "My real name is Dr. Elizabeth Warner. I'm the former head of safety systems at Advanced Aviation Dynamics. These documents are copies of reports I filed with the FAA last month." The revelation sent a subtle ripple through the small group. Rita had heard that name before. There had been some controversy in the aviation industry recently, though she couldn't remember the details. Agent Rodriguez was already on his phone, speaking quietly while maintaining his position at the curtain. In the main cabin, life had begun to return to normal, though Rita could sense the underlying tension. Passengers were pretending to return to their movies and books, but their attention remained focused on the drawn curtain at the back of the plane. The off-duty pilot had moved closer to the galley, ready to offer his expertise if needed. Agent Rodriguez's phone conversation ended with a sharp intake of breath. He showed something on his screen to his partner, whose expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Dr. Warner," Agent Chen said, his tone notably different. "We're going to need you to walk us through everything you've observed during this flight." Rita found herself pulled into an impromptu investigation at 37,000 feet. Dr. Warner described specific vibration patterns, temperature fluctuations, and subtle changes in the engine sound that most people would never notice. She spoke with the authority of someone who had spent years studying aircraft systems, her earlier hysteria replaced by professional precision. The lead flight attendant emerged from the cockpit with news. The captain had agreed to run additional system checks. More significantly, he was requesting the maintenance logs for the aircraft's last 3 inspections. "Time is critical," Dr. Warner insisted, though her voice remained steady. "The stress patterns I'm detecting suggest we have maybe 2 hours before." She stopped, glancing at Rita. "Well, let's just say we should consider our options for an earlier landing." Agent Chen made another call, this time to what seemed to be his supervisors. The galley had become a command center, with Dr. Warner's technical documents spread across every available surface. Rita noticed that both air marshals were treating her less like a suspect and more like a consultant with each passing minute. The final verification came through just as the captain requested another update. Dr. Warner's credentials weren't just real, they were impressive. The question now wasn't whether to take her seriously, but how to proceed without causing panic among the passengers. The truth about Dr. Warner unfolded like layers of an onion, each revelation more startling than the last. As Agent Chen verified her credentials through his official channels, Rita watched the transformation of the seemingly unstable passenger into someone whose expertise commanded respect. Dr. Warner headed the Safety Systems Division at Advanced Aviation Dynamics for 12 years. Agent Chen explained quietly to the flight crew gathered in the galley. She oversaw the development of next-generation landing gear sensors before she resigned 3 months ago. The timing wasn't lost on anyone. 3 months ago, right around the time of the Flight 2103 incident she'd mentioned. Dr. Warner's hands moved swiftly over her technical diagrams as she continued her explanation, her voice steady now that she knew people were finally listening. "The vibration pattern is distinctive." She pointed to a hand-drawn graph. "It starts as a low-frequency hum, almost undetectable. But over time, the resonance builds. That's what I've been feeling since we took off. She looked at Rita. That's why I kept asking about the temperature changes. The thermal expansion in the wheel well assembly creates a specific signature when there's stress fracturing. The off-duty pilot, who had been quietly observing, leaned in to study the diagrams. These calculations, he said, they're about metal fatigue in the landing gear struts. Dr. Warner nodded, a flash of relief crossing her face at finding someone else who understood the technical details. 3 months ago, I noticed similar patterns in maintenance data from multiple aircraft, she continued. The automated safety systems weren't catching it because the failure mode wasn't in their detection parameters. When I tried to raise the alarm, she paused, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. Let's just say corporate interests sometimes outweigh safety concerns. Rita watched as Agent Rodriguez returned from another phone call, his expression grave. Dr. Warner's whistleblower reports check out, he confirmed. She filed 17 separate safety alerts with the FAA. All of them were about potential landing gear failures in this specific aircraft model. The lead flight attendant, who had been coordinating with the cockpit, shared her own update. The captain says the additional system checks are showing some unusual readings. Nothing critical yet, but she glanced at Dr. Warner's diagrams. The patterns match. Dr. Warner pulled out another document, this one creased and worn as if she'd carried it for months. This is the maintenance record from Flight 2103, she said. Look at the signature pattern and the vibration logs. Now compare it to what your instruments are showing right now. The similarity was undeniable. Even to Rita's untrained eye, the wave patterns matched almost exactly. A chill ran down her spine as she remembered Dr. Warner's earlier words about not wanting more deaths on her conscience. Why did you board this specific flight? Agent Chen asked, voicing the question everyone had been wondering. How did you know? Dr. Warner's answer was simple but chilling. I've been tracking maintenance records across the fleet. When I saw this aircraft's history and flight path, she spread her hands. The conditions were perfect for a catastrophic failure. High altitude, heavy passenger load, long flight duration. I couldn't just sit at home and watch the news, waiting to see if I was right. The galley fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't a case of passenger hysteria or unfounded panic. They were facing a potential crisis backed by solid engineering data and years of professional expertise. Agent Chen's next call was to his superiors, recommending immediate action. The lead flight attendant headed back to the cockpit with Dr. Warner's technical documents, now treated like crucial evidence rather than the ramblings of an unstable passenger. Rita looked out the galley window at the peaceful blue sky, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of everyone on board, but potentially the future of aviation safety itself. The real question now wasn't whether Dr. Warner was right, but whether they had enough time to act on her warnings. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, addressing only the crew through their private channel. His tone was measured, but Rita could hear the underlying tension. They were 3 hours from their scheduled landing in San Francisco, cruising at 37,000 feet somewhere over the Rocky Mountains. The decision he was about to make would affect everyone on board. We're picking up irregular readings from the landing gear sensors, he reported. They match the patterns in Dr. Warner's documentation. We need to make a decision, and we need to make it now. Rita watched Dr. Warner's face as she listened to the technical readouts being relayed from the cockpit. The former aviation safety expert's expression grew increasingly concerned with each number. The resonance frequency is increasing faster than I anticipated, she said, quickly sketching new calculations on the back of an air sickness bag. We don't have 3 hours. Agent Chen looked over her shoulder at the numbers, then shared a meaningful glance with his partner. How much time do you estimate we have, Doctor? Based on these readings? She double-checked her math. Maybe 90 minutes before the metal fatigue reaches critical levels. We need to be on the ground before then. The lead flight attendant pulled out the flight path map, spreading it across the galley counter. "Denver International is our nearest major airport," she pointed out. "We could be there in about 40 minutes. "What about smaller airports?" Agent Rodriguez asked, studying the map. "If the situation is as critical as Dr. Warner suggests, we might need to consider all options." The captain's voice came through again. "Denver has confirmed they can clear a runway for us immediately. But we need to make the call now. Divert or continue." Rita felt the weight of the moment. In the main cabin, passengers were still going about their regular flight activities, unaware of the crucial discussion taking place in the galley. A young woman was watching a movie, a businessman was typing on his laptop, a child was sleeping peacefully against her father's shoulder. Their lives all hung in the balance of this decision. Dr. Warner spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying exactly this type of situation. "The landing gear is showing signs of metal fatigue that could lead to catastrophic failure during landing. If we wait, we risk complete collapse of the strut assembly. Denver isn't just our best option. It's our only option." The off-duty pilot, who had been helping analyze the technical data, nodded in agreement. "The readings are outside normal parameters. In my 20 years of flying, I've never seen stress patterns like this." A flight attendant called from the main cabin. A passenger had noticed they were slightly off their usual course and was asking questions. They needed to make a decision before speculation and worry spread through the cabin. The captain made the call. "Denver, this is Flight AA 2418 declaring an emergency landing request. We are diverting due to potential landing gear malfunction." The next few minutes erupted into controlled chaos. The lead flight attendant began coordinating the cabin preparation procedure while Agent Chen contacted his superiors to arrange emergency response teams on the ground. Dr. Warner worked with the flight crew, providing detailed information about what to expect and what warning signs to watch for during the descent. Rita took a deep breath before stepping through the curtain into the main cabin. She had to inform the passengers about the diversion without causing panic. Over 200 lives would depend on how well she and her colleagues managed the next 40 minutes. As she moved to the front of the cabin to make the announcement, she caught a glimpse of the Rocky Mountains through a window. Somewhere down there was Denver International Airport, where ground crews were already scrambling to prepare for their arrival. What they would find when they inspected the landing gear would either validate Dr. Warner's warnings or mark this as one of the most unusual diversions in aviation history. The story of Flight AA 2418 didn't end with a crash or catastrophe, but with a vindication that would shake the entire aviation industry. When the ground crews at Denver International Airport completed their inspection of the landing gear, what they found left no room for doubt. Dr. Warner had been right about everything. Hidden beneath the surface, in areas that routine inspections often overlooked, they discovered hairline fractures in critical support structures. The metal fatigue had progressed exactly as Dr. Warner's calculations had predicted. The chief maintenance inspector would later testify that the landing gear might have held for another hour of flight, or it might have failed catastrophically during their originally scheduled landing in San Francisco. The aftermath unfolded across national headlines. Whistleblowers MID Air Warning Saves the Flight Read one. Aviation expert risks arrest to prevent disaster, proclaimed another. But the real story was happening behind the scenes, in congressional hearing rooms and corporate boardrooms across the country. 2 weeks after the emergency landing, Rita sat in a packed hearing room on Capitol Hill. She watched Dr. Warner testify about the systematic failures that had led to that day. "I submitted 17 separate reports," Dr. Warner explained to the committee, her voice steady. Each one detailed the potential for catastrophic landing gear failure. Each one was dismissed as overly cautious. The investigation revealed a pattern of ignored warnings and suppressed safety reports. Dr. Warner's previous employer, Advanced Aviation Dynamics, had prioritized cost-saving measures over thorough inspections. The discovery led to the largest safety review in commercial aviation history. Rita's own testimony about the events on the flight became a crucial part of the record. "At first, we thought we were dealing with an unstable passenger," she told the committee. "Instead, we found ourselves working with someone who was willing to risk everything, her career, her reputation, even her freedom, to prevent a disaster." The incident sparked major changes in aviation safety protocols. New inspection procedures were implemented across all commercial airlines, focusing specifically on the subtle warning signs Dr. Warner had identified. More importantly, stronger whistleblower protections were put in place to ensure that safety experts could report concerns without fear of retaliation. 3 months after the emergency landing, Rita received an invitation to speak at an aviation safety conference. There, she found herself sharing the stage with Dr. Warner, who had been appointed to head a new independent safety oversight committee. The former unstable passenger was now being hailed as a pioneer in proactive aviation safety. The real heroes were the flight crew, Dr. Warner said during the conference, nodding to Rita. "They were willing to listen, to take action, even when my warnings must have sounded crazy at first." But perhaps the most meaningful aftermath came in the form of letters. Hundreds of them, from passengers on Flight AA 2418 and their families. "Thank you for taking that risk," they wrote to Dr. Warner. "Thank you for not staying silent." The incident became a case study in aviation training programs worldwide. Flight crews were now specifically trained to recognize the difference between genuine safety concerns and routine passenger anxiety, no matter how those concerns were presented. 1 year later, Rita stood at the gate of another flight, greeting passengers as they boarded. The industry had changed. Every pre-flight inspection now included additional checks based on Dr. Warner's findings. New sensors had been installed across the commercial fleet, designed to detect the subtle vibration patterns she had noticed. As she watched the passengers settle into their seats, Rita thought about that day over the Rockies. Sometimes, she realized, the thin line between passenger safety and disaster came down to one person willing to risk everything to be heard. The Warner Protocol, as it became known in aviation circles, wasn't just about mechanical inspections. It was about creating an environment where safety concerns could be raised and heard, no matter how they were presented. The events of Flight AA 2418 had transformed aviation safety culture. In the end, what could have been a tragedy became instead a turning point, a reminder that sometimes the most important warnings come from unexpected sources, and that true safety depends on being willing to listen, even when the messenger seems unlikely.